Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Five podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Bowen, and today we're going to be talking about his course, Myths Borrowed by the Old Testament, with Myth Vision Podcast. The link to the purchase of the course will be in the History Valley affiliate link in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment when this stream is over, and it's also pinned in the live chat. And with that being said, welcome back to the show, Josh.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
The pleasure's all mine. Can you tell us a little bit about what this course is about?
Yeah. So I guess about a year ago, Derek asked me if I'd be able to put something together that sort of goes into, in broad strokes, some of the ways that the Old Testament interacts with other myths from the ancient Near East. And of course, can be a very broad topic, but the place that you see it, I think, quite clearly is in the early sections of Genesis. So there's a section called Genesis 1 through 11, the primeval history. And you can see a lot of interaction, not just in, a word or a phrase here, but in broad aspects of the different narratives. And so what I decided to do was sort of take a step back in the course and try to explain how it is that texts in the ancient Near East interact with each other, what that even means for it to interact. What does it mean for a text to borrow another text? Did they do that intentionally? Did they do it unintentionally? Is the Bible the only place that's borrowing? Like, are there other cultures that are borrowing? Can you borrow from your own culture? There's a lot that I think goes on there. And so then, of course, we look at the Hebrew Bible itself and sort of focus in on those early chapters in Genesis and try to show with some specificity how that works. And then, we broaden it just a little bit toward the end and look more, a little more broadly at Ugaritic and how the Ugaritic texts and mythologies, particularly related to Baal, sort of engage with how the Hebrew Bible engages with those. So, all in all, it's basically designed around this word intertextuality, right? And how in particular myths are used, how they're reworked, how earlier myths are polemicized, like all of these things. We go into some detail about how that works with ancient writers and what that meant in that particular culture.
When you look at the Old Testament, you compare them to Near Eastern myths. Can you give us a couple of examples of parallels?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, usually the one that people think about first when they think about the early chapters of Genesis is the flood. And the reason that they do is not just because the story is so similar. I tell the story um, in my course that I won't tell here, but about an experience that I had in a church that I used to pastor in trying to bring the congregation along and to say, like, the Old Testament wasn't written in this vacuum, this cultural vacuum, and so there are connections here. They did not take it well, I should say. But if you look at something like the Genesis flood story, there's some very clear connections that scholars can make quite quickly between earlier flood mythologies from Mesopotamia, story like Atrahasis or Gilgamesh Tablet 11, or even the earlier Sumerian flood story, and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. And what's noteworthy, I think, one of the big things that's noteworthy is not just sort of this slavish cut and paste that's, I think, so many people conjure up in their minds when they think about something like plagiarism or borrowing or using an earlier method. That's not what's going on. they're doing it. The Old Testament writers, the writers of Genesis and redactors, are utilizing earlier um, Mesopotamian flood mythologies in such a way that they make I think, a very clear theological point. And that's really what we try to focus in on. And you see this also, if we step outside of the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11, you can see in places like Isaiah 27:1, where um, you have this Leviathan, in Ugaritic Lotan, who's called to mind in the text, and in such a way that, again, it's clear that there's a connection between this earlier Ugaritic um, section of the Baal cycle and what's showing up in Isaiah 27. But again, it's doing something with it in a way. It's bringing it into the text there in the book of Isaiah in such a way as to make a theological point. And the last example I'll give, also from the Baal cycle, is Baal is often referred to as the rider on the clouds, and you see this showing up in a couple of different places in the Hebrew Bible. But again, it's being brought over, as so many of these things are in the ancient world, to say, not your God, but our God, right? Your God is not the powerful one. Our God is. And I think that happens quite a bit in the Hebrew Bible. There's this, it's utilizing cultural, um, their cultural repertoire, and bringing in aspects of it along with, the ideas that sort of encircled, maybe, or were tied up with those earlier themes and motifs and even mythologies. And when you bring them into the later text, into the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, it brings along certain ideas, and they're brought along so that either they can say, actually, this is our God that's doing this, that has this characteristic, or they're bringing it over so that they can make a strong statement against it, or turn it on its head. And again, we go into a fair amount of detail about those sorts of things in the course.
When you face individuals that disagree, and they'll say things like, they'll either have a negative reaction towards what you're saying, or they'll claim somehow it's the reverse, they're plagiarizing the Bible. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, there's a recent evangelical scholar that I won't name, that in his book, he talks about how in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a section in tablet 11 that talks about the birds, right? If you remember the flood story in Genesis, it talks about Noah going out, releasing birds out to sort of spy out the land, and try to figure out when the water had receded. Well, this comes from Gilgamesh, tablet 11. Well, the Gilgamesh epic goes back into the early, at least, the late first half, let's say, of the second millennium BCE. But the copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh that contain, that we have, that are extant, that preserve this part about the birds, come from the first millennium, right, from the Neo-Assyrian period, which is not surprising. There's a Anyway, so I was going to go into talking about the Library of Ashurbanipal. That's probably not relevant here. But the point is that he tried to make the argument. Well, yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh is obviously earlier, but this section about the birds, um, maybe maybe the Gilgamesh epic in the first millennium is pulling from the Bible's account about the birds, because we don't see them until like the 8th century. We don't see copies of this until the 8th or 7th centuries, and it's like, what? Um, or if you know about the birth legend of Sargon, it's an Akkadian text, and of course Sargon was a late third millennium, right around 24th century, 23rd century. Um, can't remember his specific dates off the top of my head. I think he's in the 24th century, but um, there are stories about him that we have extant on cuneiform tablets in Sumerian and in Akkadian, um, that talk about interesting aspects of his life. And yet this story, the birth legend of Sargon, is one that looks to be a later text. Um, and later being like first millennium, perhaps, something written by for or about Sargon II, who was a king in the first millennium. And so the argument then gets made, well, Moses, if Moses wrote in the 14th or 13th or whatever century, uh, which is eh, problematic in its own right, shall we say? Um, well, then, clearly this Neo-Assyrian text is being taken from the Bible. And so, it's all for people that want to make these types of arguments, all about dating, relative dating, right? And obviously that's an important thing. Well, you can't have somebody utilizing an earlier text if the earlier text is later. So obviously that's an important thing, but that's not the only thing, right? It's not enough to say, well, it's possible that this Akkadian text, this part of the Akkadian text, appeared contemporaneously or was written contemporaneously with when people were writing in the Hebrew Bible. Therefore, the Bible is the original one. Like it's a nonsense argument. But I think, sort of more generally, when people react strongly to this, I think they're doing so based on like a faulty um, inference, right? And I think that faulty inference is that if the Hebrew Bible, if the writers of the Hebrew Bible or the editors or the redactors um, are utilizing earlier mythologies to compose or to redact their stories, that this somehow negates divine inspiration. Now, everyone should be aware, like, I don't think these texts are divinely inspired, right? But I also don't think that the biblical texts utilizing earlier mythologies necessarily um, uh, that you can infer from that they're not divinely inspired. Like I don't think that follows, right? Um, Again, sort of stepping into that worldview, I think that a deity could utilize, that God, the Christian God, whatever, could utilize earlier mythologies with the intent of making a theological point, and that wouldn't necessarily, um, make it so that they're like illegitimate text somehow or something. I think at a minimum, I will say, it should probably make a fundamentalist evangelical rethink their interpretive framework, right? And looking at these texts as, um, you know, accurate depictions of history or something. But I don't think it necessarily follows, in short, that Christianity is false or something, or Judaism is false. Certainly not Judaism is false, but because that's not really ever on the table. But that Christianity is somehow false because these early writers, redactors, whatever, utilizing text in the same way. I'll land here. Sorry, Jacob. In the same way that when Eminem utilizes Joan Jett's "I Love Rock and Roll," it's not lessening his creative talents or abilities, right? I think it's actually highlighting them, right? Because it takes, a creative mind to be able to utilize an earlier source in such a way that it says something new and innovative. And so like nobody puts Eminem down for utilizing that song, or aspects, or tracks, and not tracks, but sections of it or whatever. That he's actually lauded for doing that. So again, I just don't think it follows that Christianity is necessarily false because of it. So
And in my closing question, how does one determine like which text is later and which text is earlier?
yeah, it's a complicated process, right? In some cases, it's pretty clear. So the Hebrew Bible uh, was composed and redacted over centuries, right? And depending on what depending on what model one takes on the formation of something like the Pentateuch, I think everybody would agree that the canonical form that we have, the final form that we have, um, is the product of redaction, right? Of editorial work, and this took place over some time. The problem, of course, is that we don't have uh, like autographs. Right? What we have, and again, they're very early for the material that they're on, but they're coming from like at the earliest, like the late third century or something. Um, so with that being said, trying to understand when a biblical text dates to often has to rely on making connections within the canonical form, particularly when it comes to historical events. Right? So when we think about the writers like Amos or Hosea, we're dating these based on things that are internal to the text, events that are supposed to be going on at the time. Something like the book of Ezekiel or Jeremiah, we think about Babylonian captivity, and these are things that like give us hints at least to early sections maybe of these books. But of course, they've gone through their own editorial history. And so it's a complicated matter. A really good example of this would be something like the book of Isaiah, which not only has arguably, I think pretty clearly three different parts to it, right? First, second, and third Isaiah. But even sections that are, part of the Isaiah 1 to 39, first Isaiah, right? Um, are actually later texts, right? 24 to 27, arguably later. And so it's never quite that clear cut. And so that type of dating, it's a finely tuned process. But one of the things that sort of stands out as very problematic in the intertextuality context when it comes to the Hebrew Bible is that Israel isn't a thing, right, until the 13th century. And even then, do we call it Israel? Do we call it Proto-Israel? And writing isn't showing up until into the, right, like real writing isn't showing up in Hebrew until the first millennium, right? And so, like when we talk about who's borrowing from whom, um, in contrast to what we see evidentially in the Hebrew Bible, we also see, we see the cuneiform traditions, and these are extant, right? Like we have 500,000 cuneiform documents, cuneiform texts going back into the 4th millennium BCE, right? Like we have administrative texts from the 4th millennium, and then we start to get mythologies in the 3rd millennium, and tons of it, right? And it sort of explodes in number in the early 2nd millennium, and this is where a lot of these mythologies come from. A lot of these stories develop, but like the traditions are very well laid. And we have the tablets, right? We have the scribal exercises in droves in their archaeological context, right? You can go back to the ancient city of Nippur and you can see House F, right? And House F is a scribal school, and you could just see Eleanor Robeson's work or Paul Delnero's work or Nick Veldhaus's work, and they'll just lay out for you. Look, here are all the tablets that show up from the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries. And so when you have that kind of precision, both textually and archaeologically, and you can date those things with, again, much greater precision from an archaeological standpoint, because they're actually in archaeological context in situ, right? When you have that sort of thing, and you can say, all right, look, we have tablets that show the Epic of Gilgamesh, or we see Gilgamesh traditions in Sumerian that are ultimately going to be brought into Akkadian, and they go back into the early second millennium. Like it's a lot harder to sort of postulate that, well, maybe there's just this tradition that got handed down orally or something in Canaan about this, or like it's like, that's tough to do. So really, what we end up with is we can't just start. And I'll land here, Jacob. Sorry, I'm just going on and on here.
No, it's fine.
But one of the things that we can't do is, unfortunately, what I think Christian apologists have to do. And that is start with the, let's say, assumption, but conclusion that the biblical texts are somehow divinely inspired. And when you do that, and you have a particular interpretive framework, you sort of come to these texts and say, not what's likely or what do I have good evidence to build a positive case for. You don't say that. You end up saying, well, is it possible that Moses wrote this? Well, there was writing in Canaan in the 14th century. So it's like, is it possible that like somebody could have written some, I mean, is it possible that, like, that's not how this works, right? We don't say we're assuming the Bible to be correct, and now can we find a possible explanation for how that might work? No, like you'll get laughed out of, serious academic conferences for postulating things in that way. No, you say, look, here's what we have evidence for. Here's what we can see. And here's the argument that suggests, the flow of influence, right? And sometimes there's not a lot that you can say. Sometimes all that you can say is that clearly the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the Hebrew Bible, right? In whatever version you want to think of it. And so, like, however one wants to say, did the birds, story come in the Neo-Assyrian period, and that's contemporaneous with some of the writing in the Hebrew Bible, and so maybe that tradition could have, like, whatever. Like, if we see cultural transmission going from the ancient Near East into the Hebrew Bible in ways that are consistent with something that we see in Genesis 6-9 in the flood story, like, the reasonable conclusion is the Hebrew Bible is responding to these earlier flood traditions.
We got a super chat from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you very much for your super chat. Are those ArtScroll Tanakhs I see in the bookshelf? I had one and I gave it away to another researcher. Commentary said Cyprus let the Jews build the temple instead of himself. That mistake caused the nation to be later put in exile. Interesting.
Yeah. So referring to these things here. So I rearranged actually all of our books because Megan, who is the resident handy person, single-handedly built a whole series of bookshelves down in our living room, and they are just gorgeous. It's so funny. She has all these saws out in our garage, and she uses them all the time. And I went to pick one up from an auction one time, and I had to, this woman came out from the auction house to help me like load it up into the back of the truck. And I looked at her and I said, I'm beginning to think my wife doesn't like me, because she asked me if I can pick up this thing on the way home, and it ends up being this huge saw. And she goes, oh yeah, I'm sure your wife asked you to, like, this saw is hers. I was like, yeah, it is. This is her stuff. Anyway, so I redid all this. So this is starting in Genesis. These are all the commentaries that I have. And I know it's terrible to look at because they're not like, all the Anchor Bible stuff isn't together and all the Art Scroll stuff isn't together. But so like Genesis ends there, and then Exodus and Leviticus starts somewhere around here. Anyway, so yeah. Yeah, the nice thing about the Art Scroll series is, you've got they incorporate obviously the Hebrew text that you can kind of at a glance. You don't have to pound through the Hebrew commentary. You can kind of get it at a glance in the English translation. But these are people that were working with the text without the benefit that we have today of all this archaeological and Mesopotamian data and Ugaritic data, right? They didn't have it. And so they're just trying to, work within the text itself and figure out, what it was doing. So actually there were some amazing insights that you can find. Obviously, I don't agree with everything that they say. But you always want to take in evidence and data, people's interpretations. It's important.
And before we close, I just want to remind everybody once again, the link is in the description to get the course, and also it's in the pinned comment in the live chat, and it will be pinned in the comment section below. Thanks for joining me, Josh.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate you having me on, man.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.